can tell you what to make of this trading day. I just got back from the stock exchange. It's the final hour of trading on Wall Street, and it has been that kind of seesaw session for the Dow with very little volume. But we can tell you is what is driving the day. Oil prices, of course, are at a 4-year high as Donald Trump rails against OPEC and Iran. France's president, meantime, tells the world to shut out the U.S. from global trade, and Facebook shares fall as the Instagram founders sign out. It's Tuesday, September 25th. I'm Paula Newton, and this is Quest Means Business. Good evening. Tonight, Donald Trump says OPEC is ripping off the rest of the world. Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, the U.S. president took his gripes about the oil cartel off of Twitter and presented them before the world's most powerful leaders. Mr. Trump swears he won't put up with, quote, horrible high oil prices much longer.
OPEC and OPEC nations are, as usual, ripping off the rest of the world. And I don't like it. Nobody should like it. We defend many of these nations for nothing, and then they take advantage of us by giving us high oil prices. Not good.
Okay, not good, but here's exactly who Trump is going after when he lambastes OPEC. 15 nations from the Middle East, Africa, and South America. It includes, of course, his friends, like Saudi Arabia, and, of course, some enemies like Venezuela and Iran. Combined, they control about 40% of the world's oil production. Now, oil prices are rallying as energy markets seem to be blowing off the president. Brent crude is pushing up to a 4-year high. OPEC appears to be in no rush to increase its output and give prices a break. Now, meantime, Donald Trump's decision to reimpose those sanctions on Iran certainly aren't helping. And our John Defterios is in London. And, you know, that's one of the contradictions here that many people point out, is to say, look, if Iran were allowed to come back into those oil markets, as was envisioned when they had that first deal with the European countries and the United States, of course, prices could be a little bit more depressed than they are right now.
Yeah, indeed, Paula. This is a lot about politics, particularly geopolitics and Iran. And President Trump keeps OPEC in his crosshairs, and the key producers and the OPEC Secretary General, in a word, are baffled. They said they would keep the market balanced, but they think it's Donald Trump driving up prices right now. There is, in fact, 3 key factors that are creating this perfect storm, driving us to that 4-year high that you're talking about. Yes, the pressure on Iran. The U.S., since they had the snapback sanctions and said they'll put them in place on energy November 4th, have knocked out 800,000 barrels of exports already. Number 2, Venezuela continues to collapse. 10 years ago, they're producing over 3 million barrels a day. In September, according to the latest OPEC report, that's 1.2 million barrels a day. And indeed, President Trump has a point here. Russia and Saudi Arabia, the 2 largest producers in that OPEC, non-OPEC agreement, are holding back production right now because they don't see the demand. They promised in the second half of the year they would add 1 million barrels a day. They're halfway there, but the Saudi oil minister, Khalid al-Faleh, said, look, until we get the orders from our customers, we're not going to put more oil on the market. They think it's self-inflicted by Donald Trump, putting the pressure on Iran. And they're also watching, Paula, the tariffs against China. It's a big importer of crude. They see if China slows down, those orders from Asia will slow down as well. So they're not eager to put the added oil onto the market to respond to the political pressure. And we have to not forget that Iran's a member of OPEC. So even though Saudi Arabia and Iran fight with each other over Yemen, for example, in that proxy war, they have to keep the good ties within the OPEC apparatus, that umbrella, working with the non-OPEC producer, Russia, as well.
Not one thing, because it serves both of their interests in both Saudi Arabia and Iran. John, we heard again, of course, from Mr. Rouhani, who was talking again about the U.S. posture towards Iran, trying to point out some of the contradictions. I want you to listen now to him speaking to our own Christiana Manpour.
When it comes to only expressing their political will and aims, they have been quite resolute in making those announcements, which consisted of them saying that we wish to safeguard the JCPOA. But in reality, in a tangible fashion, our expectations have not been met. What the Europeans announce, what they say today, if they can put it into practice, of course the JCPOA will remain as such, and we will be able to, without the presence of the United States of America, continue with this agreement.
John, what he's talking about there is highly significant, and that is the fact that Europe would get to keep its deal on the nuclear deal with Iran and continue to do business with Iran, even if the United States doesn't like it. Operationally, John, from what you've seen in the last few weeks, because it was the Germans who brought this up in the first place, can it work?
Well, this is the Hassan Rouhani show me the money moment, I think, Paula. He's saying, let's go beyond the platitudes. If you read between the lines of what he had to say to the Europeans, take a step back. These are the 5 signatory countries beyond the United States. They're trying to work out a political deal and have the economics work at the same time. They're talking about a barter working around the U.S. dollar and trying to keep up the exports for Iran. There's a harsh reality here. If I'm a Total or BP or Shell and I have exposure to the United States, either with shareholders or with orders right now, or a big trading commodities group, I wouldn't touch this with a barge pole. I'd have the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Federal Reserve all over me. So here's the math. 2.8 million barrels of exports in June, according to the oil minister, who told me that at OPEC, 800,000 being knocked out. There's 2 million left over. Is it realistic to think that the U.S. will knock out another 1 million barrels of exports from Iran by the snapback sanctions deadline in November? Yes. Are they going to likely keep about 1 million barrels a day of production? I would think so. That's what they had when they had the sanctions under the nuclear agreement. For humanitarian purposes, the European Union, the other signatories, want to protect that for Iran. Donald Trump's trying to knock it down to zero, and I don't think that's going to be possible.
Yeah, and knocking it down to zero, he's hoping will put not just economic pressure, but political pressure on Iran. John Defterios laying out those issues quite succinctly. I appreciate it because it's getting complicated. Thanks so much.
Very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Donald Trump also told world leaders at the UN that, of course, he rejects globalism. Now, the U.S. president says his administration is taking a hard look at the foreign aid it sends abroad. He warned countries who receive U.S. aid, yeah, you better be friendly.
We will examine what is working, what is not working, and whether the countries who receive our dollars and our protection also have our interests at heart. Moving forward, we are only going to give foreign aid to those who respect us and, frankly, are our friends.
Yeah, translation, listen or else. Jamie Metzel is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and CNN's international diplomatic editor, of course, is Nick Robertson. Good to see you both, really. Jamie, first to you. I know that for those of us, all 3 of us who've traveled all around the world and have seen the good that U.S. aid does, not just for those interests in those countries, but for U.S. American interests being safeguarded around the world, let's put that to one side. Jamie, you know that this works really well for Donald Trump's base, and he seems serious. He's going to actually put policy to those words.
He probably is, and that's what's so concerning. It's true that America gives a lot of support to our allies and friends for various reasons, but one of the big reasons America gives aid around the world isn't as some kind of gift. It's because we have articulated, and past leaders have articulated, the kind of world that we would like to live in, and we have made smart investments in building that world, in building democracy and building free markets. And that takes a give and take. Foreign aid is not just some kind of protection racket where people do everything that we want. What this is about is building alliances, building friendships that endure where friends can have legitimate differences. And if we are having some kind of despotic approach toward foreign assistance, I fear that will undermine our values and ultimately our interests.
You know, Nick, at a certain point in time, the world was used to there being a certain amount of benevolence around the world from the United States and the way they handled this aid, even though a lot of it was tied aid. Some of it was tied aid to human rights. How do you think, especially when you look at allies in Europe, how are they coming to terms with this Trump doctrine, really?
Well, we've heard from President Macron on his speech this afternoon, which is a rebuke in so many ways, explicitly, of a lot of what President Trump has talked about. Indeed, he talks about the importance of working working with these international organizations. But I think perhaps if we look at what we've heard from the German foreign minister in recent months about an alternate way of supporting trade with Iran, faced with the possibility of secondary sanctions for the United States on European countries post the United States pulling out of the JCPOA, you know, and then the language, visual language of Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, standing side by side with Federica Mogherini last night, talking about exactly that. And this is the British, this is rather the European adjustment. You know, every nation, and President Trump says this, that they should look to their own national interests. But the repercussions of President Trump looking to his own national interests are beginning to crystallize in other nations around the world. Last year, people sat and listened to President Trump. They had an idea. They didn't really know the man, and they were going to see what would happen. This year, it's very clear. I think that's where the laughter came so easily, so early, in response to President Trump laying out how great America was doing, because it's almost a caricature of himself and the way that he's understood. So yes, world leaders have an understanding, and they are looking after their national security interests. And it does mean, you know, the beginning of something that one day may become a marginalization of the dollar. We're that's getting way ahead of ourselves. But these steps lead to these sorts of things.
It is certainly a risk, and that's why it was so really extraordinary that the Germans were the first to say that, look, we perhaps come up with another payment system. Jamie, into the vacuum steps China. We've covered it so much on this show. What do you think the risks are then to American foreign policy, and what is China doing actively to try and step into that vacuum?
Yeah, well, I am, as you know, just back from China this morning. And the United States really needs to wake up to the threat that China poses to the world that America has built. And America has built this world based on a set of values, based on an idea that came out of our experience out of the two world wars, that by sharing sovereignty, we don't lose something, we gain something. And ironically, President Trump and the Chinese are both putting forward the same model of international affairs based on national sovereignty. That's what the Chinese are saying in the South China Sea, is that we're going to claim this whole thing, and you, whoever it is, ASEAN or others, should only interact with us on a bilateral basis,
and
not on a multilateral basis.
Right? We're not going to come there and talk to you about human rights. We don't care about that necessarily. We're coming there country to country, nation to nation.
Absolutely. And so Trump and China are saying the same thing, and that what is being pushed aside are America's values that have underpinned the world that we have created out of the ashes of the Second World War. And these concepts of international law, of human rights, of free trade, those aren't things that people did to us. Those are the principles that we espoused that built the world in which everybody has thrived, in which our country has prospered. And so to have the president of the United Nations taking the axe to the very values that have made America great, and aligning himself intellectually with the position of the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans is deeply concerning. And that brings to your question on China. China has its eyes on the prize of global leadership. And the world led by China will be very different than a world led by the United States. The United States really needs to wake up to that, and to try to build that world that we would like to live in.
Yeah, and they're making real headway, whether just as a coincidence, perhaps, under President Trump. Nick, before we go, I'm going to really lean on your experience here with Saudi Arabia. You know, we're going to bring this whole conversation full circle. We had him talking about OPEC. Of course, the most prominent member there is Saudi Arabia. A lot of interesting moves in the Middle East and elsewhere when it comes to this alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United States. Is the United States seeing the long game there when it comes to Saudi Arabia? Because you know more than anyone how well they play at that game.
You know, and Iran plays the long game very well as well, of course. You know, I think Saudi Arabia is going through its own challenges at the moment. You know, ultimately in the near to middle term, there will be a change of leadership, but we know what the new leadership looks like, and President Trump was praising that new leadership, Mohammed bin Salman, the reforms that he's bringing to the country. These are ambitious reforms. Some would say overly ambitious and overreach. We've seen this by Saudi leaders before, talking up grand plans and not following through. My guess at the moment, while they want to have a strategy and are getting support from a lot of, you know, friends and analysts to have a longer strategy, it doesn't seem to think too far ahead. The war in Yemen would be an example. But I just want to go to China here. And I'm sorry, because I'm doglegging back out of going full circle here. But I was sitting at a business lunch, a business dinner with several hundred businessmen in Beijing recently. And I was sitting next to a former Chinese ambassador. And he said the concern that we have is that the United States thinks that our economy is growing, is going too far too fast, and it wants to throttle us back. Now, listen to what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said when he talked about the ancient Greek political, if you will, lesson to be learned, where the Spartans thought the Athenians were growing too fast. They were in isolation, as in Trump's language, separate, patriotic, separate constellations having their own space in the world, but they were separate. And they went to war because one was afraid of how well the other is doing. That's, as you're saying, exactly how the Chinese are beginning to view what's happening. And as Antonio Guterres says, that's incredibly dangerous. And we heard nothing from President Trump that would walk back any of that danger.
It is a good point that if you frame the entire debate, it is, in Trump's eyes, a zero-sum game. Gentlemen, thank you both. Really appreciate it. Now, we do want to turn to the markets now. The Dow is down slightly in the first hour of trading. Trading volumes, as I was saying earlier, are low. Investors are waiting for the Fed. I want you to take your attention to those red dots. All of that happened as people had started to settle in exactly what Donald Trump was saying at the UN. Now, we do have to say that a rise in those oil prices is boosting those energy shares, and auto stocks are down as well. We will have much more on the market later. Still to come here, though, Facebook loses 2 key executives. The founders of Instagram call it quits. Some, though, are blaming Mark Zuckerberg.